Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I'm Dianne Totten, and Kathy's not able to be with us today, so I will be your host. Today's episode of Textiles and Tea. Today's episode of Textiles and Tea is sponsored by the Weavers Guild of Greater Baltimore. We welcome your questions and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end of the program. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button and not the chat button. Today we're having tea with Peggy Hart. Peggy Hart is a production weaver and teacher who designs, produces, and markets hundreds of blankets each year, including custom blankets for sheep and alpaca farmers using their own yarn. She attended the Rhode Island School of Design, worked as a weaver in one of the last mills in Rhode Island, and has woven for the last 30 years on Crompton and Knowles W-3 looms. She has a special affinity for wool, and her book, Wool: Unraveling an American Story of Artisan Innovation, was published in December of 2017. Since then, she has been studying wool quilts and the fabrics therein. Welcome, Peggy, to Textiles and Tea. And the all-important question is, what's your favorite tea?
I drink chai, and today I'm drinking it in the Vermont Sheep and Wool Festival official mug. So that's a shout out to all sheep and wool festivals.
Yes, very appropriate. So let's begin by hearing how you got started in weaving.
Well, I started weaving in high school and I was self-taught, but eventually I found my way to Penland, where I took some fabulous classes. And then I joined the Peace Corps as a spinner and a weaver. And I went to Kenya and started a spinning and weaving workshop right on the equator in Nanyuki. And this is an early shot before we had any buildings. But the reason the workshop was there was because there were the remnants of these British colonial sheep farms on Mount Kenya. You know, even though it was on the equator at 10,000, 11,000 feet, there were, you know, huge farms with merino and Corriedale sheep. And the local Presbyterian church wanted an income generating project for women. So they requested a Peace Corps volunteer, and that's how I ended up there. And we spun, wove, started production. And then I came back after 2 years and I knew that I wanted to keep doing production, but I knew I couldn't do it as a hand spinner and a weaver. And about that same time, I met a woman named Deborah Abbott who had W-3 looms running in a barn in New Hampshire. And I thought, wow, you know, if this is a possibility, then I'm going to look into it. So then I went to RISD and took textile classes. I was there actually as a master's student, but I was able to take the power loom and jacquard classes. And when I got out, I went to work as a weaver in a mill and learned how to run these W-3 looms, where they were just running them for the sample department. At that point, even this was 1982, the looms were completely obsolete. And so they were just using them in the sample department because they're very flexible. You know, you can change the pattern chains easily. And so then I bought a couple power looms and started weaving on them. And I guess at this point too, I should mention that along the way, I had some wonderful mentors. I had a friend, Helga Reimers, in Vermont before I went to Kenya, who taught me to spin. And then at RISD, I had Alice Marcoux. And then I met Leonard Brott, who is my loom fixer friend and who has kept the looms going all these years and is still advising me. So I started weaving blankets. And at first I was thinking about bed-sized blankets, but at the time, this is the 80s, comforters had come in and people just weren't buying wool blankets. And eventually I fell into weaving blankets for sheep farmers. And that has been really fun. And that's what I mostly do at this point, where they send their wool to a mill to get it spun, and then they send it to me and I weave it into blankets for them. And that got me into weaving with local wool as well, because I was familiar with the mills, the spinning mills, and so I just started buying wool and weaving my own blankets. And so when Fiber Shed came along, I was kind of already there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Fiber Shed just for people that may not have heard the term, but
Please do.
yeah, it's a national movement that started in California, and it's basically thinking about getting your textiles locally or making them locally rather than buying them up from overseas, and also to be using local fibers as much as possible in what you're doing. So at this point, I'm working with a Western Massachusetts fiber shed, but there's affiliate groups all over the country and even all over the world.
So this is really how you got on the path of working with local farmers and preserving the history of the wool and educating the public about that. Is there anything more you'd like to say about that?
No, I think I said most of it.
Yeah, you've covered.
Yeah.
Okay. So next, I think we've got an image of the Crompton loom that you use now. Would you tell us the history of this loom and how you came about purchasing it? It's just fascinating to me.
Well, this is one of 4 down in my studio. And this is one of the first ones I got. This is an 82-inch loom weaving width, but the whole thing is, about, I don't know, 10.5 feet long, maybe a little more. And Crompton and Knowles was a company that made looms in Worcester starting in like the 1840s. And they made looms for 100 years and then stopped. And this is one of the last looms that they made. It's a totally mechanical loom and totally automatic, where there's a big old motor on it and the harnesses go up and down, the shuttle goes back and forth, the beater goes back and forth. There's an automatic advance and let off in the back. So I can turn this loom on and pull the handle and it just goes. And it's fabulous. I mean, it's been great for what I do, because it's being as I decided that I wanted to work in the to make blankets years ago. This is a good size for that, and it's just a workhorse.
Okay, am I seeing dobby bars?
Yes, you are.
It's a dobby, so
it's a dobby loom, right?
Okay, that's what I thought. And so how often do you have to change the dobby, the pattern? How often do you change patterns?
Every time I put a new warp in. And
okay.
So the really terrific thing is that I can easily change the pattern chain. Sometimes I change it even in the middle of a warp, because sometimes for a sheep farmer, I'll say I'm weaving them 100 blankets and they don't want them all to be the same. So I will change the pattern somewhere in the middle so that they end up with different blankets to sell. And that's usually working with I'll have planned ahead of time, and maybe it'll be just like a 16 harness straight draw. And so it's easy to, change it to a different 16 harness pattern.
Okay, do they dictate to you what patterns they want, or you show them what patterns you are willing to do? Or
Yeah,
how does that work?
it's a combination. Sometimes they have no idea what they want, and they go to my website and they look at what I've got. If they actually come to visit, that's terrific, because I have swatches from, decades that they can look at, and sometimes that will inspire them. Sometimes they come with a really specific idea in mind, like a particular warp stripe pattern, for example, something more graphic.
Okay, okay. So, and I think we've got a picture coming up of what looks like the back beam that you're putting warp on this.
Right.
Can you discuss this process, and how is this different with a commercial loom compared to what most of the rest of us use?
Yeah. So with a power loom, the tension has to be perfect. And this makes it perfect, which is really a joy. And so the way you wind warps for a power loom is sectionally. And what you're not seeing is what's on the other side of the dressing reel. So the big cylinder in the middle there is the dressing reel. And on the other side of the dressing reel is the creel that holds the yarn, and then also something called a hack stand, which has a special reed in it that you can make a cross with. And so I wind the warp section by section. And in this case, you can see it's a warp stripe. And so the section is quite narrow. So it's only, like 3 or 4 inches or so. So I will set up the creel with the yarn with the color pattern, and then I will wind the first section at one end of the creel, and I will wind it so many yards. And there's a clock on this so that I can set it for however many yards I want, whether it's 100 yards or whatever it is. And at the end of that 100 yards, then I cut off that section and I tie the next section on, move the reel over on a track. Can you see that it's on a track?
It looks, are we looking at the green, kind of like a green disc on the right hand side?
Don't look at the green disc. Look at the reel.
Okay.
And then look down between the reel and the green warp beam is a track. So
okay.
It's on wheels. It actually moves over on the track.
I see.
Say I've just wound a 3-4 inch section. I crank the reel over 3 or 4 inches, and then I lay down the next section next to the first one.
Okay.
And then I just keep going until I have as much wound as I need. And then what's different from a hand loom is that then you have a separate step where you put it on the back beam. So it's essentially tension twice, which makes the tension really terrific.
Now that makes more sense.
Yeah. So what you're seeing happening at this point is the green beam is the warp beam. And this is a warp beam for actually one of the looms at Lowell, at the Lowell National Park, because I make warps for them. And so they send me their beam and I make a warp and put it on their beam, and then they come and pick it up and take it back.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So once I'm ready to beam, once the whole, reel is full of however much yarn it needs, then I will attach the ends to the warp beam and then beam the warp. And it has a separate motor. So that's another little machine called a beamer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's really fascinating. I love machinery, but let's get back to more about wool production, because I know that's very, very important to you. And for some of us, how many of us don't even think about where our yarn comes from and how it gets produced. So would you talk a little bit about the wool production in the United States and how important that is?
Well, I start everything with the premise that wool is a good thing and that
Mhm.
that we need it. And if you look at the history of what people wore from the beginning of colonists coming to America, they wore a lot of wool. And when they first came, there were no sheep here. So we have always imported wool in some fashion, starting from the colonial days when England wanted us to buy their wool.
Mhm.
That's partly why they wanted a colony. And there weren't sheep. And then gradually there were sheep. And we divorced ourselves from England, and then we started our own production. But I'll just detour just to say that wool is the original miracle fiber, and it's warm when it's wet. It takes color well, it's flame resistant, it's biodegradable, so you can recycle it. And the wool production in this country has waxed and waned. And yet raising sheep has always been a part of the agriculture of our country. And at this point, I think it's important to support sheep farmers because their raising wool helps improve the soil in the country and can sequester carbon. And also, if you think about transportation costs and the carbon footprint of, our clothes coming from China or, wherever they come from across the ocean, it's much more efficient to just make whatever we can here.
Okay, so is that the reason you like to buy local? I mean, rather than perhaps look elsewhere to where you could get the best price that
Right. Well, yeah. So it's to support the local farmers, but I will also say that when I buy local wool and make yarn, I can make exactly what kind of yarn I want.
mhm,
You
mhm.
can tell the spinning mill what you want. And I tend to work within a fairly narrow range of what I'm weaving, because I'm making blankets. And I'm not making really fine stuff, although I have made fabric like for our local fiber shed, and then it's spun finer. But it is really fun to be able to control your raw material. And
Mhm.
as far as options for people that don't want to make their own, buy local wool and go to a mill and all that, there are companies in this country that are using all American wool, like Brown Sheep in Nebraska and Green Mountain Spinnery in Vermont.
Okay, so besides wool, what other fibers do you use?
Well, I'm kind of a purist. I I make cotton blankets as well for people that
Okay.
don't want wool blankets. I did also do a run of Lindsay Woolsey some
Mhm.
years back with a linen warp and a cotton weft.
Okay, do you ever do all linen?
No.
No, okay.
It my looms are woolen looms. They're,
Okay.
the W-3 stands for woolen. And
Oh,
so where I have run linen warps, the looms don't like them so much.
okay.
There's just tension issues.
Choose.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. They like what they were made to do.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
The
now
same
you stick, oh, go ahead.
Oh, the same company, they made cotton looms and silk looms and, you
Oh,
know, very specialized looms for all different kinds of purposes.
but all the looms you have are woolen looms for
Correct.
wool.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Now, you've stated that your weaving is inspired by original traditional designs, such as we're seeing here. Would you talk more about that for us, please?
Sure. I tend to think of weaving in terms of structure and, you know, warp face, weft face, that sort of thing. And
Mhm.
I have always loved kente cloth, which is, you know, warp surface, weft surface structures and playing around with the possibilities. And so the piece on the left is sort of inspired by kente cloth. And then I also really love South American textiles where the warp might be set very close together. So you get these very, you know, saturated color stripes. And I also have a thing for blocks and stripes. So that's what I'm looking for when I'm looking at traditional textiles, including
Mhm.
American.
Okay, so your idea is really, you're inspired by anywhere in the world, wherever they come from. Just if you're inspired, you go after that and they become part of your designs. Is that correct? Would that be a correct statement?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm not trying to literally borrow, I guess. But I'm responding to some
Mhm.
of the really
Being
fun
being
patterning.
inspired by.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay. So um, we have some examples, like here's an example of a good color, both color and pattern. So do you consider yourself a color person or a pattern person?
Well, it depends what I'm making.
Okay.
I do an awful lot of white on white because a lot of sheep farmers only have white wool. So,
Mhm.
so there, you know, I'm working with various kinds of textures to make some sort of a readable design.
Mhm.
And uh, the sheep farmers, sometimes they have natural colored wools. And so I'll do something with those. Um, for my own work, for my own blankets that I sell, it's really fun to play around with texture too, and texture and color both, as in this example that you see. This is also what I call to clean out the studio warp, where I had lots of different colors and put them all in the warp and then tried to get them to hang together with the weft that I used.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Do you
But
ever dye your yarns?
no, well, I have dyed, but because I have to work with cones, yarn on
Mhm.
cones, it's
Mhm.
just that one extra step, and I don't always have the time to do that. But I'm also, you know, beyond color and pattern, I'm also a fiber person, you know, so I have very specific fibers, as you might have picked up on. You know, have I said the word wool enough?
Okay, so what's a typical day like for you? Does every day include designing, warping, and weaving, or or maybe a typical week?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, a typical day. I'm always doing all of those things. And I honestly, I can't stand to weave more than about 2 hours a day.
mhm,
And so I usually don't, but I am also winding that, you know, I'm always keeping the production going. So I'm winding the next warp, or I'm weaving samples for the next warp and talking to the sheep farmer about whether this is what they want to do with their wool, or I'm finishing the blankets because I do
mhm,
it all. You know, there's nobody else down in my shop.
mhm,
And so there's a portion of each day, like today, I wove. I'm going to be finishing blankets once I get off this Zoom. I talked to a sheep farmer. I might be researching a weave structure that I am thinking of for the next project as well.
Okay. Do you have all 4 of your looms warped and going most of the time, and projects in different stages so that you can move from one thing to another?
No, typically I just have one loom running,
Mhm.
and then so I warp it and then weave it off, and then I'm on to the next thing. Because I'm trying to get the blankets back to the sheep farmers as fast as possible. If I'm weaving some blankets for my own,
Mhm.
then I might have 2 looms running. And I'll toggle back and forth depending on whether I've gotten the deposit yet from the sheep farmer or whatever.
Okay, I'm just curious, with weaving, when you say you weave for a couple of hours, now we sit at the loom and push the treadles to weave. You aren't doing that. You have the Dobby loom, and do you have to throw the shuttle, or do you stand at the loom? How does this all happen? Just give us a picture of how this
Yeah,
all happens.
I stand at that, and that's the other thing. I can only run one loom at a time because
Yeah.
I have to watch in case of warp thread breaks. I'm winding bobbins at the same time. I have a bobbin winder, and that's tucked in around the back, so I can run back and forth and wind bobbins at the same time that I'm weaving. But I do kind of have to watch it, and also most of my blankets have fringe, so I have to pull up the warp in between the blankets.
Okay.
So I have a measuring string going always, so I have to make sure that I haven't woven longer than I meant to weave for that particular blanket. So it takes, even though I'm not throwing the shuttle or moving the harnesses, I'm still
You're the overseer of that it all gets done
right.
the
I'm
way
the
it's supposed to.
quality control.
Yes. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the looms? I mean, they're just so fascinating to me. What's the most fascinating thing about working on a commercial loom?
um, well, I love the history of this company and these
Mhm.
looms. And the thing is, they made most of the woolen and worsted looms that were used in the whole country. They were really successful, and they were constantly making improvements to them. And um, but as a mechanical thing, they are great.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So who fixes them if something happens? That's you too, I would imagine.
I
You know,
can do most of the easy stuff, and then I call my friend Lenny,
okay.
and all these years he's usually been able to come over. He is at this point 97, so it's
Oh my
getting
goodness.
scary. Yeah. So I have a manual for them. And
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Well,
it's usually pretty straightforward what's wrong with them,
yeah. Okay. Okay.
except when it isn't. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, now you have written a book about the history of wool, and I've purchased the book and I'm very impressed with it. And the pictures are great in it, and I've done a little bit of reading, and it's just fascinating. I'm looking forward to um, reading it cover to cover, and I think it's just I was impressed by the quality of the book, the quality of the pages, everything about it. I was just impressed with. So thank you for doing this for us to learn. But how did it come about that you were writing this book?
Well, thank you for your kind words. I didn't start out to write a book at all. I mean, I was a history major in college, but so I guess I always had that sensibility, but I truly didn't start out to write a book. I started thinking about the history of the Crompton and Knowles company, and I was just thinking about how integral they were to the industry, and the fact that they stopped making looms and then the industry pretty much tanked. And so my interest, and I started writing or putting together presentations for weavers guilds. And the first presentation was the history of the company. And then I went forward in time and, like, why did they stop making looms and what's happened to the woolen and worsted industry in this country? And then that was depressing. So then I went back in time and I thought, how did people make cloth in this country before the Industrial Revolution? And so I started, so at a certain point, I had enough enough pieces of the story that they started to stack up as chapters. And I thought, well, I suppose this could be a book. And I pitched it to Schiffer, and they went with it. And I didn't also set out to write 400-year history, but I've finally decided I wanted to, because I didn't want to just end with the demise of the woolen and worsted industry. I wanted to go on to where we are with the sheep and wool festivals and the resurgence of interest in hand spinning and knitting with hand spuns, and then I went back in time, and so before I knew it, I had 400 years. But all along, I kept thinking, well, what is the question I'm trying to answer? What is the point of this book? And I channeled my 11th grade history teacher who said, what is the question you're trying to answer? And so I finally decided that it was a story about consumption, and where did we start with consuming wool in this country, and where are we now, and if we want to keep the sheep industry going, what do we have to do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, in the book, there's a word that I hadn't heard before, casimir. And
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Would you explain what casimir is?
So casimir is one of those words that sound really cool, but it's actually something quite simple. It's just a word that's gotten lost. But casimir was first, it's a lightweight woolen fabric, twill. So that makes it different from flannel, which is a plain weave or broadcloth. It's not heavily finished. It was first patented in England in 1760 something. But it's the fabric that everybody wore. You wore it. It could be underwear. It could be a vest. It could be children's clothes. It could be women's dress material. And the original patent was for a 2-2 twill, just very simple straight twill. But as the woolen industry developed in America, designers in mills started designing fancy cashmeres, and there's a gazillion of them out there, and playing around with color and weave effects. And so there's that. Does that answer casimir?
Yes, very, very well. And I also noticed that there's a few other words that kind of been lost over the time. Do you have any idea how that happens, that we just lose track of some of the words that the words that describe, like, are a name of something, that it evolves into another name?
Well, like casimir in particular. So if you look at all of the like dictionaries of textile terms, starting from like 1880 on, the name starts changing, and eventually, as the woolen industry got almost replaced by the worsted industry, different yarns, different fabrics, the the worsted industry borrowed all of those designs, all those woven structures that had been created for the woolen industry. And so then they started calling those fabrics cashmeres, the worsted fabrics cashmeres. And then it just fell off at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's next for you?
Well, what I'm really excited about right now is my fiber shed. We're making wool pellets. So the idea that you're going to use every piece of the wool, we're taking the waste wool and we're pelletizing it to use as a soil amendment. And I just happen to have some right here. I mean, I don't know how well they would show up, but they look like, you know, rabbit food pellets or something, except that they're wool. And so the idea is that as we work through all of our, you know, hundreds of pounds of wool every year, and we can't send all of it to the mill because a lot of it isn't good enough quality for the mill. So we're going to pelletize it and try to sell it as soil amendments.
Okay.
Something to use in your garden. But I'm also continuing my study of wool quilts because that's something I started looking at wool quilts when I was trying to find these forgotten fabrics like cashmere and satinette, and I just totally went down a rabbit hole looking at them, and they're absolutely charming. You know, there's all kinds, and I have a couple articles coming out soon about wool quilts, and I've had one wool quilt show so far, and I'm looking for other venues if anybody has any ideas of.
Okay. Where are these articles going to be? What you said, a couple articles coming out. Where will they be published?
In Handwoven.
Oh, great. Okay.
At the end of the year.
Yeah. Okay. Super. And are these quilts, wool quilts you have, are those ones you've collected?
Yes.
Or okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Our COVID dirty secrets. I started looking at these wool quilts on eBay. And they were so cheap and they were all so different. And it, you know, I have not invested much, but I have a really fun collection at this point.
Okay. And how old do you think the oldest one is that you have?
Oh, maybe 1900 or so.
Wow. Cool.
And then I also started making my own wool quilts.
Sure.
Yeah. So
like you don't have anything else to do. Why not?
right.
Okay, well, let's just go to see what questions. I'm sure we've got some questions in the Q&A, and see if I can get to them here. They aren't, for some reason, I'm not seeing them. Let me just go. Why am I not seeing my questions? Well, Elizabeth, is there?
Dianne, you may need to toggle to get your menu to show up.
Okay.
While you're doing that, I'm looking at, as I see Susan Simpson went to Nanyuki Spinners and Weavers, and that warms my heart.
Okay. Okay. For some reason, I'm not going in the right spot, I guess. What? Let me just see. Okay, got it. Okay. Okay, here's one from Karen LeBlanc. I'm in awe. The looms are huge. How much do the Crompton and Knowles looms weigh? And do you need to have a special studio floor and infrastructure to house such a beast? Thanks. What a great question.
Yeah, right. Well, they weigh about 1.5 tons each. And yes, the reason I live where I live was because there was this barn with a really level concrete floor. And I need, you know, you have to have a level floor. So that's
okay.
Yeah.
And Mary Holm is saying, I used to live one town out of Worcester. Where was the Crompton and Knowles factory located?
Well, where the foundry where they, because these are all metal looms, was a little bit south of town, down 146, where all the big box stores are now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, from Nancy Feynman is asking, how is a wool loom different from a silk or cotton loom?
Well, for one thing, the width, because wool was usually woven wide, and and cotton looms are typically, you know, narrower.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the woolen looms have more harnesses. I say harnesses, that's just because that's what they are called by Crompton and Knowles, but shafts too, in other
Right.
words.
I think it's
Yeah. Yeah,
more the era, a word for the era.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cotton looms, cotton fabric is typically just plain weave, or the masses of it was. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, Sandra Miller's asking, what are some of your favorite breeds of wool to work with?
Well, I still love Corriedale, and Merino, and Rambouillet, and I mean, I have worked with so many different breeds with sheep farmers. Um, I like Shetland for the colors. Yeah, each breed has their own characteristics and charm, and it's good for different things.
Okay, do you combine the breeds in a blanket to get the different color variations using their natural colors? That's just my question.
Yeah. No, typically, well, the sheep farmers, they only have one breed. So what they have, it may be in different colors, but it's all the same breed. The fiber shed, Western Mass Fiber Shed, we've been collecting wool for 4 years now, and then sending it to get spun, and then I weave with it. And that is just whatever comes in, it's a whole mishmash of different breeds.
Okay. Carrie Gordon is asking, is the mechanical loom loud to operate?
Yes, it is. And I wear ear defenders when I
Okay.
work. Yeah.
Okay. And Beth Wrench, I'm not sure I pronounced that right. She's wondering where your studio is located.
I'm in Western Massachusetts in Shelburne Falls, and on my card, I say, come visit. And I've had Weavers Guilds come visit. And anyway, I'm always open to people calling me and setting up a time to come by.
Super. Okay. Laura McWhirter wonders, are there still commercial looms like this available today, or anything geared to production on this level?
Not the Crompton and Knowles, pretty much, because they got broken up and sold for scrap,
Oh.
starting about the time that I was getting them. I went to buy harnesses once I was always scrounging parts when I first got the looms. And I went to Uxbridge and to Stanley Woolen Mill, and they were breaking up the looms and throwing them out the window in pieces. So Crompton and Knowles looms, not so much. There's more modern shuttleless looms that are available. It's not for the faint of heart. And it's a commitment, especially you can't move once you get these things.
I guess not. Susan Nelson is wondering if there are any commercial loom firms left in the US. In other words, I guess anyone still building them.
No, not
No.
that I know of, not that I can think of. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Carrie Gordon is asking, wool pellets, are they or the process available for the general public? And she's also fascinated with wool quilts. I'll be on the lookout for your articles. Thank you, Peggy. So
The
are they
pellets,
available for general public?
they will be available. There's one company making them for sale right now in the US, and that's they're out of Utah, Wild Valley Farms, I think. And if you Google them on Amazon, you'll find them. But a number of us are trying to gear up to get these on the market. And so we don't have our own machine yet. We're working on getting one.
Oh, okay. Okay. Edith Lord is wondering, what kind of loom do you use for sampling? And maybe that goes with someone else mentioned about, looks like you have a Maycomber behind you. What do you use that for? Could that be, May Chester was asking about your loom behind you. Those two questions go together?
Yep. So it is a Maycomber, and I will use it for sampling if I only need 10 shafts, because
Okay.
it's only a 10 shaft loom. But I have a designer Dobby, which is also an old in industry hand loom, a Dobby loom, and that I can have 24 shafts on. So if I need that many, that's what I use.
Okay. And maybe you said this and I forgot what you said. How many harnesses do you have on your W3 looms?
I have up to 20.
Okay.
But
Okay.
over the years, I've gotten a little bit smarter, and typically I don't use more than 16, and 2 more for the selvage.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
because the more harnesses you have move up and down, the more trouble you can have too.
Good point. Good point. Going along with you talking about salvages, but also Janet Stolness was wondering, how do you finish the blankets? You mentioned something earlier about fringe. Is that
Yeah.
the only way, or what? How do you finish your blankets?
Mostly I do either a flat fringe or a knotted fringe, and that's just because that's what the sheep farmers want. On my own blankets, occasionally I'll do a twisted fringe, but it takes so long. It takes twice as long for me to do the twisted fringe as to weave the whole blanket. So, I have to add a lot of money. It adds a lot to the cost. Oh,
Okay.
and that's the other thing I meant to say, that when I came back from Kenya, I was thinking about production. I also at the time thought, I want to make stuff that's affordable. I don't want to make $800 blankets. I want to make affordable blankets. And so that was the other thing that got me into weaving on a power looms.
Okay. Karen LeBlanc is asking if you ever put the wool in duvets.
One could, yeah. And certainly you can buy, there's a couple companies that sell inserts, wool inserts from like Frankenmuth in Michigan. Yeah.
Okay. Here's one. Susan Nestle is saying, hi, Peggy. Do you have any interns or people interested in working with you? Hudson Valley Textile Project is having its annual summit next Wednesday, April 12th in New Paltz. Lots of wool talk.
Yeah, all these years I've never had anybody work with me because the machines are dangerous, and my shop is definitely not OSHA certified. And so, yes, I think about succession at this point, like who's going to run these looms when I can't. I just have never been able to answer that question, and I would consider having somebody, for a short period of time that can help with this and that, but I have to run the looms myself, and I have to make the warps by myself, because that's a really important detail is if you don't make the warps, they might not be perfect and then you can't run the loom. And I believe Rabbit Goody makes her own warps too.
Okay. I think this question kind of can be combined. Melissa Weaver Dunning is asking, are the wool quilts whole cloth quilts? And Kyler Agostino is saying, what is a wool quilt? So can you address those two questions?
So the wool quilts that I've been looking at are all pieced quilts.
Okay.
And a wool quilt is just like a cotton quilt, except that it's usually not quilted. It's usually a top and a bottom and some sort of a filler, and and they're usually tied because it's so thick that you can't quilt it the way you could a cotton quilt.
I see. Okay. And Sarah Broomfield is asking, do you wet finish your wool blankets?
Absolutely, because you have to wash the blankets if they're blankets that the yarn has just come from the spinning mill, they've still got spinning oil in them, and I have to wash that out. But the fulling process is an important piece of your wool. It's a process. It's part of the process of making something as much as weaving it, because the wool is going to kind of lock into itself. And I always calculate it to shrink a lot. I mean, I make samples to calculate the shrinkage, and some breeds shrink more than others. So it looks completely different on the loom than it does off the loom. And it looks different again once I've washed it.
I've lost the person's name, but they were asking what considerations when you're wet finishing, what's the most important thing to consider? And actually, I have a question too to go with that. I assume these blankets are pretty good sized. Where do you wash them? Do you have a special place that you wash them?
Nope. Most of the blankets I make are 48 by 72. They're throws, and I can wash 2 at a time I've got a good top loader, and that's what I do. If I have a warp of like 400 blankets, which I have had, there's a really terrific business out near Boston that will wash them all for me. So I'll just send them the whole bolt and they'll wash them all, and then I'll get them back and cut them apart.
Okay, so let's say you just have a couple and you put them in the wash machine. What do you set the machine on?
Gentle, 6 minutes, warm, and a mild soap.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then do you let them air dry or?
Yeah, they all air dry.
Okay, let's see. Here's Carrie Gordon is asking, I imagine the set for the industrial looms might be different from what we would use on our floor looms. What set do you use for the alpaca and wool warp yarns for the blankets? And she says, lovely patterns and love our local flocks here in Central Oregon. So
no, it's exactly the same,
okay.
Depending on what size the yarn is. So like I say, an important part of my process is making a sample swatch to begin with, because you need to see how that yarn is going to react to the weave structure. And yeah. And then I wash the sample, so I have all the information I need to blow it up into the larger blanket.
Okay, here's a question going on along with the size and washing from Sherry Diamond. Can we get clarification? Are the blankets 48 by 72 before washing or after washing?
After washing. And they can be anything from 64 inches wide before washing, and they shrink down to 48. It just depends. Like right now, I just finished a warp of Rambouillet, which is lovely fine wool that shrinks a lot. And so it was, 64 inches in the loom and 48 inches after it's washed.
Okay, but you find all this out by your sampling
right
at a time and having done enough of each breed to know what to expect.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Judy Howard is asking, do you have to do substantial retooling to run alpaca fiber? I imagine she means as opposed to wool. Does it make a difference?
No, it's the same, other than alpaca has less elasticity to it. And it's more the spinning that's different with alpaca, because alpaca just wants to escape. And so it has to be plied, it has to be fairly hard twisted to run well and not start to come apart after it's washed.
Okay. Claudia.
But mostly I work with singles yarn. That's another thing I guess I didn't mention.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, so that's another great thing about being able to make my own yarn or having the mill make wool for sheep farmers is I always tell them singles because it's cheaper to make singles and the singles just kind of lock into each other better.
Mhm. Okay, Claudia Coco is asking, what is the longest warp you've warped?
800 yards.
And how many was that for blankets?
No, that was for Lowell, for
Oh.
the cotton mill, because they have to schlep their beams out here and back. They wanted me to make as long a warp as possible. And it
Okay.
was also small cotton yarns, so I could fit it all on my warping reel.
Okay, so Lowell is still, I know there was a textile museum there that is closed. So what is Lowell? What is happening in Lowell now?
It's the boot cotton mill as part of the national park. And
Oh,
anybody who hasn't been there should go because it's pretty fabulous.
okay. Okay. Well, I'm just looking at the time and hate to say that we've run out of time. This has been totally fascinating. And I apologize to everyone whose questions I didn't get to. But it's been great talking with you today, Peggy, and just I hope to come visit you.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll let you know ahead of time, though.
Okay. And any I'm happy to answer any other questions that people can just email me.
Okay, let's see, did we put the email address in the chat?
No, but it's blanketweave@gmail.com.
Oh, okay, that's easy. And also you can get more information off from Peggy's website at blanketweave.com. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay, okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Peggy, on Textiles and Tea. It's been a real honor for me to be able to talk to you, and thank you again.
Great to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you. Okay, so we want to thank again, a special thanks to the Weavers Guild of Greater Baltimore for sponsoring today's episode of Textiles and Tea. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Textiles and Tea, you can learn more at weavespindye.org. Textiles and Tea is supported by generous donations to the Fiber Trust. If you would like to see more programming like this, please support HGA by becoming a member or by donating. You can join and give on our website at weavespindye.org. Now, if you've missed part of this episode, would like to watch it again, or share it with a friend, Textiles and Tea is recorded and can be viewed on HGA's Facebook page or subscribe to our YouTube channel where you view the entire series and more. Now, please join Kathy next week when she shares tea with Emily Dvorin. Thank you and happy tea.